99.1 KLBP, Low Power FM, Long Beach.
And briefly, the reason why we're introducing woodcut novels, these are essentially, Dean will explain more, but they're blocks of wood that artists use and carve out a block of wood and use it essentially as a stamp. And these are the earliest, in some ways, the earliest precursors to what we would call now the graphic novel or more adult and literary comic book stories. So, we're going back 100 years or so to really talk about the origins of, again, what are now more.
Are we ready to move on to woodcuts?
Let's talk about woodcuts. In fact, I'll turn it over to you a little bit because I know this is kind of your forte, explaining the difference between the two various types of approaches to this particular art form.
Well, Jeff, as Jeff mentioned earlier, that woodcuts are these are stories told visually, told through static images. They are carved in wood. Each block might be different sizes. They can be like 3 inches by 3 inches or 4 inches by 5, depending on the size of wood at hand or the size that the artist chooses. And they tell stories. There's no words, so it's pantomime. It's silent movie style storytelling, I suppose. And the two that we're going to focus on here. There are others. It's a very small club, by the way, to complete a complete woodcut novel. But we're going to talk about Frans Masereel and Lynd Ward. And when you get a chance to look at these books, the first thing you'll notice that between the two artists, that one is much more detailed, one looks a lot more controlled, textured. That would be Lynd Ward, while Frans Masereel's got a rougher, more kind of organic feel. And that's because each artist is engraving on these blocks in a different way. Masereel, he is a woodcut artist by definition, in that he is carving on the plank side of the wood with the grain, so the grain is running across the wood, and what that does is it causes a looser, rougher line, because when you're using the knife, you'll hit that grain, and your knife will follow the grain to a certain extent, and the other type of woodcut is actually wood engraving, which is what Lynd Ward does, and that would be cutting on the butt end of the wood, the grain end of the wood. So think of a loaf of bread. You're cutting on the face of the bread, so you're not contending with the wood grain. So you use gouges, and you can use tools that are that can cut multiple lines. You don't have to worry about the wood grain forcing your knife one way or the other, and you can get much more detailed work. And my thesis is on this, that each of these artists, Masereel, who does the looser, more raw style cut, versus Lynd Ward, who does the much more detailed and controlled cut, I find that to be kind of indicative of their storytelling manner. When you look at a Masereel novel, you'll see a lot of scene-to-scene changes, where he'll like a single image will represent a single scene, and it'll jump to the next day, the next week, the next year even. And there's even in The Passionate Journey, we were talking about this. A girl grows up in the matter of, she goes from 5 or 6 years old to 15 in one panel, and then she becomes an adult in the very next. So you have a lot of these scene to scene, which requires a little bit more work and imagination on the part of the reader. So Masereel is handing over control of his line to the grain in the wood, just as he's handing over a little bit more control to the readers as they're imagining. And then conversely, you got Lynd Ward, who's very controlled in the way he lays out his stories, but you'll see that he's also controlling his narrative by having more cinematic feel. He has less time happening in between the panels. He'll jump from one subject to another subject within a single scene. A single scene in his storytelling could be 3, 4, 5 single panels, where Masereel will dedicate one. And I think it takes a little less imagination on the reader's part reading Lynd Ward, because he's giving you smaller increments of time between the panels.
Lynd Ward is filling in the gaps of the story more so in large parts of his stories. Frans Masereel is letting the reader really play with those gaps and kind of fill in their own ideas more. There's less time represented, I guess.
And I was doing a little bit of boning up. I have this big, huge compendium of all of Ward's work, and it came out in the 70s. It was a reprint from the 70s of everything he's done. narratively. And he wrote head notes for every story. And in the first book, which is called God's Man, he talked about he really had a difficult time. You got to remember this is late 1920s. He was thinking hard about the amount of space between the panels and how much time passes, and he realized that if he showed too many steps of the action, that he was going to lose his readers. And then conversely, he discovered that if he put too much space in between them, that he was afraid that he might lose the narrative thread and lose his reader. And I think he did a really just beautiful, wonderful job in telling his story very clearly. And I think he was thinking about concepts in comics very early, because later on you have people like Scott McCloud in Understanding Comics, who talks about these very things, about how much control that the reader has in imagining what happens between the panels. And I just kind of appreciated Ward's forward thinking there.
Yeah, the connections between early woodcut novels, and remember, we're going back, 70, 80, 90 years here.
The earliest one was 1918 by Masereel, and they consider that the first one.
And the connection, obviously, between these early woodcut novels and comic books becomes obvious when you start looking at them. Remember, picture this, if you haven't pictured it already. You're flipping through a book, and generally speaking, there's, for the most part, one picture per page. So you're flipping every page, and generally speaking, there's one
I want to
picture.
clarify that even further, because I have a feeling everybody that's listening right now is thinking on the left side you have one panel, on the right side of the page you have one panel. That's actually not true. They were originally published on, you want some technical book jargon here? I'll give you some. On the verso, I'm sorry, not the verso, on the recto, which means the right-hand side of the book, on the right-hand page only. So when you looked at the left side, which is the verso apparently, there's no image. And the reason why they did that, these books were literally printed on the blocks, and they didn't want the images rubbing against each other. So you were literally like, these things read really fast, like Passing Journey, I think it has 137 panels, and that's how many pages it has. And you just flip, 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 flip. And it's a really interesting reading experience because of that. And sorry, I didn't cut you off on that.
No, it's also cool because, I mean, for the most part, again, there's no hardcore rules here, I guess, but it's mostly black and white. Sometimes you'll see a secondary color kind of injected in for like interior mind scenes or dreams or whatnot. But for the most part, what you're looking at is black and white. And I read a little introduction in one of the books that I was rereading here, and he mentioned that the eyes are meant to take in pictures of any sort through the rods and the cones, and that the rods are more fully developed initially, before the cones are. In a baby, for example, the rods are developed, the cones aren't, and the rods detect black and white. So he was making the case, and I kind of like this idea, that woodcut novels, as you're flipping and looking at these pictures one at a time and letting the story kind of unfold before you, they're also done in black and white, and that's an artistic choice that's very appealing to our baby souls, that this is the most rudimentary type of picture that we originally, as a child, as a baby, can actually see. We can't really see color. And so for me, that picture driving forth the story is appealing. And of course, Dean and I are both obsessed with comic books. My interest in woodcuts came, literally decades after my interest in comic books. But you can see how comic books have kind of adopted the woodcut novel storytelling technique, in that there are a number of artists in comics who have decided to tell comic book stories without words too. Jim Woodring's Frank stories, Peter Cooper, although he's working with color in this comic book called The System. And there's a number of attempts over the years to do a large graphic novel, even if it's just pen and ink work, without words at all. And those stories always grab me. Dean and I actually have tried a 40-page long story where there's no words, and it's tricky to pull off to make sure it communicates.
The pantomime story or the silent story, those have always intrigued me from the beginning. When I very first started making comics, one of my first ones was wordless story. I want to back up when you mentioned Peter Cooper and Eric Drucker. They're modern comics artists that have done big works that are wordless, but I would also like to mention they're just a natural progression of the woodcut novel. Remember, with the woodcut, you're removing, you've got a block and you're removing material, and what stays behind is going to pick up, the high parts are going to pick up the black, and the low parts are not going to pick up the ink. So they're removing. So Peter Cooper, you didn't mention this, but he's a stencil artist. A lot of his comics, he's literally cutting out cardboard and grabbing a spray can and spray painting his comics. Eric Drucker, he mimics the woodcut in a style that kind of is reminiscent of like scratchboard. So again, you're removing the black to reveal the white, and then Seth Tobachman also plays around with stencils, and he does an art style that's very chunky that feels, even if he's not doing stencils, even his art style is reminiscent. So there are still artists today working in narrative form using wordless stories and still cutting in order to draw.
And just to throw out a few titles, check out Eric Drucker's The Flood. Or is it Flood? Check out Peter Cooper's The System. Check out Jim Woodring's stories, the Frank stories. Check out some of these books that are just mind-blowingly beautiful to look at. And I guess Seth Tobachman's World War III Illustrated, a magazine where he has a lot of stuff appearing in it too, an anthology. These are, if you're interested in comics as a medium, if you're interested in storytelling that's profound and interesting and something you've never seen before, these are some current cartoonists who really work with that, that same woodcut novel structure, just letting the pictures tell the story.
So let's actually jump into. Okay, I'll ask you. Ward Masereel. What do you want to go with?
Let's start with Masereel because he's really the guy that if you haven't figured out, it's Frans, as in Frans, Masereel, Masereel. He's the one who really kind of invented this form. So let's start with him. I don't mind talking about the idea.
Yeah, he's our woodcut novelist. He's Belgian, very much influenced, I suppose, visually by the expressionist artist. Although I suppose it's argued that he's not expressionistic. I disagree. The first one he did, which they consider to be the first woodcut novel, was only 25 images, and it's called Passions of a Man. And that was 1918. And the same year, he started a longer one, The Passionate Journey, which I think is his most favorite. And by the way, he sold 100,000 copies of that. I don't know if I told you that the other day, which is a huge number just to me in terms of a graphic novel. That's a lot. That one, I think I said 137. It's actually 167 images. And I just kind of wanted to talk briefly about those two stories, and that Passions of a Man is basically a story of a boy. He grows up in poverty. He's abused by by workers. He works as a child. He grows up. Again, money is hard to come by. Food is hard to come by. Struggle. He gets empowered by unionism. Begins actively fighting with labor. Gets arrested. In the end, he's executed. To me, that story is only told in 25 images. Was just like a blueprint for what came later, which was Passionate Journey, which was done in the same year. And he went from 25 images and leaped up to 167 images. And it's not the same story in that we have an execution, but it is. I just felt like when you look at Passions of a Man, like you can just see him inserting panels and
filling out the story a little bit. Right?
Yeah, a little bit, a lot. I mean, he quadrupled the thing. And it's about a guy who comes to the city, and he just these one-panel scenes where he's doing all kinds of things. He's picking up women. He's getting robbed. He's saving people from drowning. He's disrespecting the power structure, whether he's laughing at police officers, farting, or showing his butt towards the priests.
Well, I think let's break it up, because at the beginning, really in the first half of the story, maybe the first third, you're seeing snapshots, like picture like you're flipping through somebody's photo album. You're seeing snapshots of a fairly conventional life, but when you start talking about him, farting in the clergy's face, or that's Canterbury Tales too, right? In some ways, when you see him in the second third and the third third of the book, he's really starting to go against convention. The first book, he's kind of living a conventional life. You're seeing scenes that most people would experience in their own lives. But by about halfway through, he's starting to flaunt convention. He's flaunting his women in their, sultry dresses, and
There's one that the woman has such outlandish black eye makeup. She's a lady of the night, and he's walking past all the hi-hats, all the people with money, with this what I interpret as a prostitute, and just parading her like a princess. They're just beautiful single panels. Each one is a story into itself, right?
And he's very much growing and evolving as a person. As the story progresses, you can tell he's starting to wake up. He's starting to laugh at convention and stature and position and authority. He's laughing at the man who wants to give him a gun and fight. I'm guessing as a soldier. Yeah. He's laughing at the clergy. He's laughing at convention throughout the entire second half of the book. He's laughing because he's having a good time. And he doesn't care what people think.
And that's the journey, right? The journey to become this person who can see beyond the superficial. And then just real quick, I want to talk about the ending with you. The story, for the most part, takes place in the city with a digression where he travels Africa and Asia, and he returns to the city. And then at the end of the book, he walks out into the woods. He walks into the forest. And this seems to be a fairly common image in these woodcut novels, that somehow nature, they're almost kind of a transcendental kind of idea that you walk into nature and you're somehow closer to God, closer to the truth. And when he goes out there, he kneels, he raises his hands, he's surrounded by flowers, oversized flowers and giant leaves. He raises his hands towards the heaven. And then the next panel, this is actually one of the few action-to-action transitions in the book. He raises his hands, kneeling, falls back, laying dead, and he still has human body, but he has a skull. And then this is where it becomes surreal and becomes a little more metaphoric rather than very literal. You see image of him. He still has his human body wearing his pants and coat, but he's still got a skull, and he's in like storm clouds, and he's literally stomping on a heart. Whether it's his heart or not, I'm not sure. It can be interpreted different ways. And then the next panel, it jumps to the next scene, and he's barefoot, and he's still got that skull, and he's walking the universe. He's walking among planets. He's walking among stars, and I think he's smiling. And I just think it's a beautiful, understated, or maybe it's overstated, image of this man's journey and where he begins. And I don't know, you want to talk about the heart? You want to talk about the walking in the universe? I think it's just great images.
Well, the whole idea that an individual man's life is just that, an individual man's life, but somehow when you die, you become bigger, that your life becomes an idea, that your life becomes larger than life, that after your death, you get to reside, more or less in the realm of myth. That's kind of how I see it. We play with that idea in one of our books too, Moses walking the cosmos.
And I'll admit, I tried to swipe that at some level when we had Jeff instructed me to draw Moses walking the universe, and I tried to swipe that image because that story, Passionate Journey, is so close to me, and I just couldn't make it work. So you got my own version crossed up with Jack Kirby there.
I liked it. That's our graphic novel, Moses, by the way. Word up.
Some other time we'll talk more directly about that book, I suppose. Just real quick on Lynd Ward. Lynd Ward is American, and he was in Germany studying art, as most American art students want to do. And he read a story called The Sun by Masereel, and that's what inspired him to do his first book. But I would like to actually talk about his third book, called The Wild Pilgrimage. And in this one, this one's kind of interesting that I mentioned earlier that in the woodcut novels, often this idea of retreating into nature was very popular. And in this one, in some ways, he undoes it. This one, we have an everyman who is explicitly drawn unattractively. And Lynd Ward talked about he didn't want to make him look heroic. He didn't want him to be heroic. He wanted him to become just anybody. And he's in the city, and industry and labor is not working for him. And where does he go? He goes into the woods. But I think Lynd Ward is kind of undermining this idea that if you go to nature, you're seeking truth, that you're seeking the face of God.
Well, the first thing he sees is a lynching, right? Yeah. A black man being lynched in the woods by a bunch of ugly white guys.
So it undermines that I don't know, I'll use the word trope, I guess. But he goes on his own journey, and he meets a farmer's wife, or a farmer, and he starts working for the farmer. He tries to get, I think he's trying to rape her, but there's a scene where he's forcing himself upon the woman. So he's not a good man, and I really appreciate that because I think he's trying to create a character that is somehow not good, but yet still a victim. So he's not invoking just pity, but deeper understanding. And then the book is the first woodcut novel to use a secondary color. So you'll have the present day, the objective reality is printed in black and white, and then you have this subjective reality where you're inside the protagonist's head, and it's printed in kind of a brick red color. And so that becomes very subjective. So you'll see, for instance, with this rape scene, you'll see him in the red in his subjective mind for a moment. You'll see romantic images where they're embracing under the stars, and then you cut to the next one, and it cuts back to black and white, and the woman is struggling against the man that he's forcing himself upon her. So the structure, Ward made a huge leap in the structure, and he was very happy to come upon this idea. And it's so simple as it is, just changing color, that it really opened narrative for him in ways that he hasn't able to explore before.
And those color shifts really are striking visually, but like you're saying, it adds a layer of understanding to the character. I don't. Yeah, he's neither bad nor good. Those brick red scenes. It's what, 4 panels, 6 panels. It actually has the farmer's daughter essentially standing in front of him provocatively, completely nude, and enticing him. And then he's on his knees in the next picture, and she's kind of taking him. Then you flip the page. Again, we're talking one page at a time, one picture at a time, flip, flip, flip. And then you see him towering over this woman, and she's obviously being aggressed against. That juxtaposition, that play between what he sees in his own mind, her essentially conquering him, and then the reality of him conquering her, that's a beautiful counterplay, and you're doing it without a single word.
Yeah. That's a very sophisticated book. In the end, he returns to the city, and you have this really dark subjective point of view in the red, where he sees the boss man, the man,
the authority,
and he has a machete, and he literally takes his head, and he's holding it, kind of Macduff style at the end of Macbeth, and he holds the head up to the labor, and when he holds the head up, you realize that the head is not the labor boss's head, but it's his own head, and then immediately it cuts to the next scene. And again, there's an interval there that I think I'm a little unclear. The very next black and white scene, the objective reality, he is on top of the labor man, choking him. So he becomes this hero that destroys labor, but the next moment he's choking the man. And then that somehow is tied to this idea that he's killing himself, that when you act in violence, you're somehow harming yourself. And in the end, he just winds up getting shot in the riot. But that moment, I'm still not quite clear what's going on with the head that's himself. He's a hero holding up the head of the vanquished, but it's himself. It's not necessarily labor, but he is labor.
And see, when you're asking these questions, you're indicating one of the powers of non-word storytelling, picture-driven storytelling. You're asking questions and you're not really sure what's going on because there's no writer there explaining to you. There's no narrative voice. There's no captions like a comic book where the narrator's telling you what's happening or explaining the philosophies that drives the story. The power of wordless stories is just that. The reader gets to respond.
Yes.
The reader gets to put themselves into the story. If you're curious about other authors, by the way, there's two other great woodcut novelists, Giacomo Patri and Lawrence Hyde. Check out
and Otto Nuckel. Sorry,
yeah, he actually worked in lead, right?
Yes.
So check out White Collar or Southern Cross. There's a great anthology edited by George A. Walker called Graphic Witness, 4 wordless graphic novels. And Dover Press put out a great copy of God's Man by Lynd Ward.
As well as Passionate Journey by Frans Masereel. So hit your local bookstore. If you have to hit the internet, do it. They're there. They're beautiful, beautiful books. And that's it for this week. Had a blast talking about the Melvins. Had a blast talking about the Woodcut novels. And this is KLBP 99.1, Low Power FM, the Long Beach Radio Project. We're recording from the Devero Sound Experience. This is the Westerino Show, and we're going to leave you with a little bit of Melvins.